I used to believe that family was the one thing you could count on when everything else fell apart. I held on to that belief for 31 years. It took one phone call to destroy it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the hospital where I worked, still in my scrubs, too tired to drive home. My shift had ended 2 hours ago, but I'd stayed to cover for a colleague who'd called in sick. Again, that was the kind of person I was back then. The one who stayed, the one who covered, the one who said yes when she should have said no. I was a respiratory therapist at Mercy General in Columbus, Ohio, and I was 31 years old, and I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. My brother's name was coming up on my phone screen. I almost didn't answer. "Hey," I said. "You need to find somewhere else to stay," he said. No hello, no build-up, just that. I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "The room. I need it back. My buddy Travis is moving in next month and I already told him he could have it. I've been renting the spare bedroom in my brother's house in Westerville for 8 months, ever since my divorce from my ex-husband had finalized and I'd had to give up the apartment we'd shared because I couldn't cover the full rent on my own. My brother had offered the room at what he called a family discount, $700 a month, utilities included. I paid on time every single month. I'd bought groceries. I'd cleaned the shared kitchen without being asked. "You said I could stay as long as I needed," I said. "I said as long as it worked out," he said. "It's not working out." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after he hung up. The October sky was doing that thing it does in Ohio, heavy and gray and low, like it was pressing down on you specifically. I kept waiting to feel something clean, like anger. Instead, I just felt hollow. I had 26 days. I spent the first week telling myself it would be fine. Columbus wasn't a cheap city anymore. Remote work money had pushed rents up. But I made decent money. The problem was my credit. My ex-husband had put several things in my name during our marriage without telling me. A credit card. A personal loan. When we divorced, he'd stopped making payments. By the time I found out, the damage was done. My score had dropped to nearly 200 points. No landlord in a decent neighborhood would touch me. I applied to 14 apartments in 3 weeks. 12 rejections. 1 wait list. One that wanted a co-signer and I had nobody to ask. My parents lived 40 minutes away in Grove City. I drove out there on a Sunday afternoon with a casserole dish because that's what my mother had always taught me. You don't show up empty-handed when you need something. I sat at their kitchen table and I explained everything. The eviction timeline, the credit situation, the wait list that might not come through in time. I asked if I could stay with them for a few months. Just until I got back on my feet. My father set down his coffee cup and looked at me like I'd asked him something embarrassing. "You're a grown woman," he said. "You made your choices." My mother didn't say anything. She just started clearing the plates, even though we hadn't finished eating. I drove home in the rain. I want to be careful here because I spent a lot of time being angry at my parents, and I know that anger can distort things. But what I remember most from that afternoon wasn't even what my father said. It was my mother's silence. She knew what my ex-husband had done. I told her everything, and she still cleared those plates. The last week before I had to leave, I moved fast. I put most of my furniture in a storage unit on Morse Road. I packed what fit in my car. 2 suitcases, a duffel bag, a laundry basket with my work shoes on top. My brother stood in the doorway of the house and watched me load the car. He didn't offer to help. When I was done, he said, "I hope things work out for you," in the same tone you'd use to say goodbye to a coworker you barely knew. I drove away and I didn't let myself cry until I hit the highway. The first 2 nights I slept in my car, parked at a 24-hour Kroger on Cleveland Avenue. I'd read that parking lots like that were safer than side streets because there was always foot traffic, always lights. I kept my doors locked and my phone charged. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd figure something out. By the 3rd morning, I was too stiff to drive comfortably and too exhausted to think straight. I called 211 Ohio Social Services line and they gave me the address of a family shelter on the north side that had space for single women. It wasn't what I'd imagined when I heard the word shelter. It was clean. The staff were kind. There were rules: curfew at 9, no guests, chores rotation, and I followed all of them because following rules was something I was good at. I shared a room with 2 other women. One worked nights at a convenience store. The other was dealing with something I never asked about because she didn't want to talk, and I understood that. We coexisted quietly, the 3 of us, and there was a strange kind of dignity in that. I kept working my shifts. I kept showing up. I told nobody at work what was happening. Every morning, I used the shelter's bathroom to get ready, and I ironed my scrubs in the common room, and I drove to the hospital and did my job and came back. I don't know what I would have done if someone had asked me directly. Nobody did. It was a Friday evening in November when I met him. I'd stopped at the CVS on Carl Road on my way back to the shelter to pick up ibuprofen. My back was a wreck from the combination of long shifts and a shelter mattress that had seen better days. And when I came out, he was sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the parking lot. An older man, maybe early 70s, in a gray wool coat that had once been expensive and now had a torn pocket and a missing button. He was holding a paper bag from the sandwich shop next door, but he wasn't eating. He was just sitting there, very still, in the cold. I don't know why I stopped. Normally, I kept moving. I'd learned to keep moving, but something about the way he was sitting, not slumped, not defeated, just utterly still, like a man who had stopped somewhere and forgotten how to start again, made me slow down. "Are you okay?" I asked. He looked up at me. His eyes were sharp. That was the first thing I noticed. Not confused, not unfocused, just tired. "I sat down to rest," he said, "and I find I'm not entirely sure where I'm going." I thought maybe he meant that literally. "Do you need me to call someone?" "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "I don't really have anyone to call." I sat down on the wall next to him. I don't know why. My ibuprofen was in my bag. The shelter curfew was in 2 hours, and I had no good reason to sit down next to a stranger in a CVS parking lot in November. But I did. His name was Arthur. He told me that much right away, like he wanted to be polite. He was from Cincinnati originally. He'd lived in Columbus for 40 years. He had a daughter in Arizona and a son in the city, but the son, he said this carefully, like he was choosing each word, had recently told him that the arrangement they'd had was no longer working. "What arrangement?" I asked. "I've been staying with him," Arthur said, "since my wife passed, 14 months ago." He said it quietly, not looking for sympathy, just stating a fact. I asked him where he'd been since his son told him to leave. He'd been at a motel on Broad Street for 3 weeks, he said, but he'd run into some difficulty accessing his accounts. He said this in a way that made me think there was more to that story, but I didn't push. "You can't be sleeping outside in this," I said. It was 38 degrees and dropping. "I'm aware," he said, with a faint, dry smile. I thought about the shelter. Single women only, I already knew that. I thought about what I could actually do versus what I wanted to do. I thought about every voice that had ever told me not to get involved with strangers, not to make other people's problems your own. I thought about my mother clearing those plates. "I know it's not ideal," I said, "but there's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here that's open until 10. You could sit inside, stay warm, and tomorrow morning I can help you call around. There are shelters that take men. I know a couple of numbers." He looked at me for a moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's cold," I said, "and because someone should." We went to the coffee shop. I bought him a coffee and a slice of banana bread because he hadn't touched the sandwich. We sat across from each other in a corner booth and he talked, slowly at first and then more easily, about his wife. Her name had been Patricia. They'd been married 43 years. She'd been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and grew tomatoes in the backyard and laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. He talked about her the way you talk about someone who was the organizing principle of your entire life. Not with sentimentality, but with a specific aching precision. I told him a little about myself. Not everything. He didn't ask for everything. He just listened in the way that some older people do, with a patience that feels almost old-fashioned. Like they understand that listening is something you do with your whole self. By the time the coffee shop was closing, I called the men's shelter on Livingston Avenue and confirmed they had a bed available. I drove Arthur there myself. He thanked me at the door, formally, genuinely, the way people used to shake hands. And I drove back to the shelter and made it in by curfew with 4 minutes to spare. I thought about him the next day. I stopped by the Livingston shelter on my lunch break to make sure he'd gotten settled. The staff member at the front confirmed he was there. I left my number in case he needed anything. He called 3 days later. He needed help figuring out why he couldn't access his checking account online. I spent 40 minutes on hold with his bank and another 20 explaining to the representative that no, the account holder was present, he just needed help with the interface. By the end of it, we'd figured out that his son, who had apparently been added to the account as a joint holder years ago, for convenience, had frozen Arthur's access somehow. The bank representative grew very careful and very quiet when we explained the situation. She gave us a number to call for their elder financial abuse team. I want to be clear, I'm not a hero. I was a 31-year-old woman who was sleeping in a shelter and working 12-hour shifts and barely holding my own life together. But I knew how to make phone calls. I knew how to be persistent without being rude. I knew how to navigate systems because I'd spent years navigating hospital systems, and Arthur needed someone who knew those things. Over the next few weeks, I helped him file a report with the Columbus Police Department. I helped him contact an elder law attorney, a woman named Patricia, which made Arthur smile, whose firm offered free initial consultations. I drove him to appointments on my days off. He always thanked me. He never assumed I would help. He always asked first, and when I said yes, he received it with a kind of gracious dignity that I found unexpectedly moving. I didn't know anything about who Arthur had been before. He didn't volunteer it, and I didn't research him. He was just Arthur. A quiet, sharp-minded man in a damaged wool coat who was navigating a terrible year. It was the attorney who first mentioned it, gently, at the end of a meeting in early December. She was talking about the assets that would need to be accounted for in any legal action, and she said something about the original charter documents and the board of directors, and I heard the name of a company and something in my brain skipped. The way a record skips. "I'm sorry," I said. "What company?" The attorney looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at me with that quiet, careful look he had. "Hay founded it," he said, "a long time ago." The company was a logistics and supply chain firm that had contracts with several major retailers across the Midwest. I'd seen their trucks on the highway 100 times without ever connecting the name to anything. According to what I pieced together over the next few days, Arthur had stepped back from active management when his wife got sick. His son had taken an increasing role, and somewhere in that transition, the son had begun treating what was Arthur's as if it were already his own. I want to be careful here too, because I never fully understood all the legal details, and it's not my story to tell completely. What I understood was this: Arthur was not a poor man. Arthur was, in fact, a very wealthy man who had been systematically isolated from his own assets by someone he trusted. And the reason he'd been sitting on a concrete wall in a CVS parking lot in 38-degree weather was that his own son had made him feel like he had nowhere to go. I cried in my car after that attorney meeting, not because of who Arthur was, because of what that meant about who his son was. Because I kept thinking about the 14 months after Patricia died, and Arthur staying in that house and slowly, quietly, being made to feel like a burden and a guest and finally an inconvenience. The legal process moved faster than I expected once the attorney got involved and the bank's elder financial abuse investigation began. I won't pretend I understood all of it. What I knew was that Arthur's son was removed from the joint accounts, that certain documents were reviewed, that there were some very tense weeks in January where the attorney told me not to call her every day, which was fair. Through all of it, Arthur was calm. Not a removed, shut-down calm, a considered one. Like he decided what mattered and what didn't, and he was conserving himself for what mattered. In February, Arthur moved into a furnished apartment in German Village while the longer-term arrangements were sorted out. His attorney helped with that. I helped him pick out a coffee maker because he was very particular about his coffee, and the one in the furnished apartment was, according to him, an embarrassment to the concept. I had moved out of the shelter by then, too. The waitlist apartment had come through in January, a one-bedroom in Clintonville, older building, good landlord, rent I could manage. I'd spent 2 days cleaning it before I moved in, and I remember standing in the empty living room feeling something I hadn't felt in months, something like solidness. Arthur came to see the apartment once. He brought a plant, a pothos, he said, because they were difficult to kill and he knew I had a lot going on. He sat in my one good chair and drank coffee, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important. It was one of the better afternoons I'd had in a long time. It was during one of those visits in March that he asked me something unexpected. "What do you want?" he said. Not in a grand way, just quietly, like he was asking what I wanted for lunch. I didn't know what to say. Nobody had asked me that in a long time. "I don't know," I said. "To feel stable, I guess. To not feel like I'm one emergency away from losing everything again." He nodded. "What would stability look like for you?" I thought about it. I talked about paying down the debt my ex-husband had left me with, about wanting to take a course in healthcare administration. I'd been interested in moving into a management role but had never had the time or money to pursue the certification. About wanting, eventually, to not be scared of my own bank account. He listened. He didn't offer anything. Not that day. 2 weeks later, his attorney called me. She explained that Arthur had asked her to reach out regarding something he wanted to discuss with me formally. I went to her office on a Thursday afternoon after my shift. Arthur wanted to pay off my debt. All of it, the credit card, the personal loan, everything my ex-husband had left in my name. He also wanted to fund the healthcare administration certification program I'd mentioned. And he wanted to offer me a role, if I wanted it, in the foundation he was in the process of establishing. The foundation was going to focus on elder financial protection and housing stability. The attorney explained the terms clearly and told me to take time to think about it. I looked at Arthur across the conference table. "Why?" I said. "Because you sat down," he said, "when you didn't have to." I'm not going to pretend I didn't cry. I did. The attorney handed me a box of tissues with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been in this situation before. I thought about my brother watching me load the car. I thought about my father saying, "You made your choices." I thought about my mother and those plates. I thought about sitting on a concrete wall in a CVS parking lot in November, because I had nowhere to be and nothing to lose by stopping. I said yes. The debt was cleared in April. I started the certification program in May. The foundation work was part-time at first, then grew. I was good at it, navigating systems, making calls, being persistent without being rude. It turned out those skills mattered enormously in elder advocacy work. Who knew? My brother called in the spring. He'd heard something from my parents, who'd heard something from my cousin. He said he was glad things had worked out. He said it the same way he'd said, "I hope things work out for you," in the doorway. That coworker tone, that careful distance. I said thank you and I got off the phone and I didn't call him back. My father called in June. He wanted to have dinner. I said I was busy. It was true. I had a full life. I had a foundation board meeting and a study group for my certification and dinner with 2 women from the shelter whom I'd stayed in touch with. I was busy in a way I hadn't been in years. Busy with things that were mine. My parents never apologized. I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about whether I needed them to, whether it would have changed anything. I don't think it would have. What happened in those months, the parking lot, the coffee shop, the phone calls, the attorney's office, that happened because of the person I chose to be when I had nothing. No apology was going to make that more or less true. Arthur and I still have coffee on the second Saturday of every month. He's doing well. His daughter from Arizona came to visit in the fall, and they're slowly rebuilding something. He still has the coat, the gray wool one with the torn pocket, but he had a tailor fix the button. When I asked him why he didn't just buy a new one, he said he'd had that coat for 30 years and saw no reason to give it up now. That's Arthur. Exactly, Arthur. Last month, I sat in on a panel at a community center on the east side. We were presenting information about elder financial abuse. Resources available, how to report, how to help. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. She was maybe 23, still in her coat, and she said she'd been thinking about getting involved in advocacy work but didn't know where to start and didn't feel like she knew enough to be useful. I thought about what I'd known when I sat down next to Arthur on that wall. I'd known how to make phone calls. I'd known how to be persistent. I'd known that it was cold and that someone should. That's enough to start, I told her. You'd be surprised how far that gets you. I've thought a lot about what actually changed my life. People who heard the story later, the few I told, assumed it was Arthur. his money, his foundation, his generosity, and yes, those things changed the material facts of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined sitting in that Kroger parking lot at 2 in the morning with a bad back and a shelter curfew to make. But that's not what changed me. What changed me happened earlier. It happened on a concrete wall in 38-degree weather, when I had every logical reason to keep walking and I didn't. I've spent time trying to understand why my brother could look at me loading my car and feel nothing. Why my father could say, "You made your choices," and mean it as a closing argument rather than an opening to conversation. I don't think they're cruel people. I think they made a decision, maybe not consciously, maybe just through years of small choices, that self-protection was the highest value, that getting involved cost too much, that the safest thing was always to keep moving. I almost became that person. I was learning to be her. The shelter taught you to keep your head down, mind your own, preserve your energy. And that's not wrong, it's survival. But survival and living are different things. And somewhere on that walk out of the CVS, I chose living even when I couldn't afford to. That's not virtue in some grand abstract sense. It's just, I knew what it felt like to need someone to stop, and nobody's stopping. I knew that feeling in my body, the specific weight of it. And I couldn't add that weight to someone else when I had the option not to. What I didn't know, and what I think matters most, is that the capacity to help, even when you have almost nothing, is a form of intelligence. Not book intelligence, something harder to teach. It's the ability to see past your own emergency long enough to recognize someone else's. My brother had more resources than I did and less capacity to use them that way. That's not a judgment. It's just an observation about what we practice and what we let atrophy. Arthur used to say that his wife Patricia was the smartest person he knew, and when I asked him what he meant, because he was clearly no one's idea of unintelligent, he said she was smart about people. She knew what someone needed before they said it. She knew when to push and when to just be present. That kind of intelligence, he said, can't be bought or inherited. It has to be built, the same way you build anything, by showing up, paying attention, and being willing to be wrong. I think about that when I work with people now. Not everyone who comes to us for help is easy to help. Some are angry, some are suspicious. Some has been let down so many times that they've developed an allergy to being helped. I don't take it personally. I just stay in the room. I stay patient. I keep making the calls. My father thinks I made my choices. He's right. I made them on a cold November night in a parking lot, and I would make them again and again and again. That's the only thing I know for certain.